Well, welcome everyone. This is the last week of term, but it's good to see so many of you today. Today's event has been organized by the Center of Pan-African Studies in collaboration with the Pan-African Society, student-led here at SOAS. And so welcome to our event today. So before we start, I will tell you the fire exit. In case of alarm, you have a fire exit here and a fire exit there, and you just follow the signs. So make sure that we move in the ordinary method. So a few words, since we started a little bit late, and we want to make sure that we engage with our panelists who have an extensive expertise and can bring insights from different aspects, from different segments of the diaspora. So just a few words about the Center for Pan-African Studies. The Center is a platform here at SOAS for promoting interdisciplinary research, policy dialogue, and public engagement on issues related to the African continent and its diaspora. It's based at the Department of Politics and International Studies here at SOAS. And it facilitates the development of new and ongoing joint research projects, publications, seminars, and collaboration with scholars, civil society, and institutions in Africa, the UK, and beyond. I did introduce myself. My name is Dr. Mikael Woldu. I am a postdoctoral researcher here at SOAS and a part of the Center of Pan-African Studies. Our partners are the SOAS Pan-African Society, which is a group of African students who believe that Pan-Africanism is the only way forward for African people. And their aim is to unify African students at SOAS to collectively cultivate knowledge and understanding of African history and politics, to discuss and address issues affecting Africans, both on the continent and the diaspora, and to celebrate a diverse range of African culture. So welcome on behalf of the Center and the Pan-African Society. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. So we'll have a panel discussion first, and the second half we'll open it to Q&A. Okay? How does that sound? Great. All right. So let's start with our panelists. To my left, we have Dr. Christy Kwarteng, PhD, who is a research associate at the Center for Pan-African Studies. She's a migration and diaspora specialist with 10 years of experience working with international organizations, academic institutions, and civil society organizations. Then we have Myron Sotunde Adesima, who is the outreach manager of the student-led SOAS Pan-African Society, where she's leading an initiative to provide aid in Sudan. She's currently pursuing her second master's degree in international studies at SOAS with focus on Africa. Next, we have Buzayo Twins, who's a political commentator and content creator specializing in critical analysis of political and social issues. She's the creator and host of the Everything is Political series, highlighting the politics embedded in everyday life. Next, we have Elvina Quezon, is the CEO of Shabaka, a diaspora-led research and advocacy organization focused on diaspora humanitarian response. With over 20 years of experience in international development, her work has focused on diaspora engagement in humanitarianism and development. Last but not least, native to Sudan, we have Mubarak El-Amin, who has dedicated the last 20 years of his life to providing aid and sanctuary to the innumerable victims of the Sudan conflict. Trained as a filmmaker and director, political instability forced him to flee. He's the founder of SOS for Sudan and Kilma, supporting Sudanese in the UK in West Sudan. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
So the reason why we wanted to put this panel together at this joint is to kind of talk about the impact of the recent aid cuts that have happened in Europe and the US, and what that means in terms of the role that the diaspora, the African diaspora specifically, can play in supporting the continent, but also engaging with Africans within the diaspora. So I'll start with Elvina. And I wonder if you could kind of help us and set the scene of the impact of those aid cuts on the development sector and the humanitarian sector, especially given the work that Shabaka does, working with diaspora-led organizations, but also civil society on the ground.
Okay, sure. Hi, everybody. Good evening. I think I'll actually start by going back to 2005, where I was a student here, actually, doing diaspora and refugee studies. It was the first cohort. And I remember being in a class and we were talking about humanitarian sector and what's going on with the system and everything. And it all started there with the system's broken, it's not working. What do you think needs to happen? How do we improve upon it? And the conversation went round and round in a circle and then came back to trying to fix it within the parameters of what was already there. There was no innovative thinking to get out of that box. And I remember thinking, we're sunk, like this way of thinking is not going to get us anywhere. And then fast forward to now, we're seeing that. We had the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016. Everybody again was talking about how the system's broken. We need new ways of working. We need to encourage localization, which is where the diaspora fits in and civil society fits in and all of the sort of grassroots responses to humanitarian and development issues and responding to those fits in. And so a lot was spoken about, and there was promise of providing up to 25% of funds to these groups. It didn't happen. System's broken. Nothing was done about it. And then we get to a point where you have a seismic shift of dramatic proportions take place. And then, of course, the system can't respond to that. So we had the US cuts, which amounts to about 50 to 60% of global aid. And then you had the UK making reductions, bringing down aid to 0.3% or working towards that from the desired 0.7. So it's already been shrinking. And for me personally, I kind of feel like for all of the donor countries and institutions, they were almost wanting and waiting for an excuse or permission to be able to do what they really wanted to do within the aid space, which is to shrink the aid space. And so we have the US government shift, and then very quickly we see the cuts and other changes happen very quickly and dramatically. And then all we've seen after the moment of uproar is others starting to echo that. So we're seeing varying European countries talking about the cuts and the reductions that they're going to be making in their aid budgets. So what this means is that the amazing work being done on the ground is going to be extremely difficult. It was already becoming difficult to get funding, and now it's going to become even more difficult. And equally, we have to look at the fact that what the countries are going to do, I would argue this has already been happening, which is aid being provided in ways to countries, to groups that will benefit the giver, the donor country, which makes sense. I mean, we say it's benevolent, but really it's tied to geopolitics and all of those wonderful things that keep the world spinning. And so we're going to see that happening in just a much more obvious way. It's like the blinkers are off, the curtain's been pulled. They are saying aid is going to be tied to national interest. So what this means then is that there will still be funds available. It just means then the grassroots organisations, what ways are you going to be bending ourselves to be able to access these funds? For the recipient countries, what agreements are they going to be signing? And they are already doing it, we've seen it. But now, again, as I say, it's going to be more obvious, it's going to be more clean cut. And we've already started to see it, again, America leading the example with the agreement with Ukraine and their minerals. And there seems to be a lot going on with that. And the whole world's turning into a really mad series, Netflix series. But yeah, we live and learn. And so it's really going to come down to what do the diaspora want to see going forward? Are we going to sit back passively and talk about how terrible it all is and how this isn't right and how they have a moral obligation to be covering these things, which they very obviously do. But are we going to just fall in line, or are we going to use this as a moment to take a step back and review what is it that we're really trying to do here? If we are diaspora who really care, can we harness these funds? I'm sure you've all heard about the amazing amounts raised in remittances, but that is really the vast majority of that is person to person, sometimes community to community. Are we going to be able to come together and actually harness those funds into a fund or into some sort of constructive amount that can then be utilised by our home governments? And if we are going to have our home governments access these funds, are we going to hold them more to account? Are we going to hold each other and ourselves to account? Are we going to start working collectively so that we actually have a bigger voice and can make more of the amounts that we do have? These are some of the things that I feel this is a moment that diaspora organisations need to be thinking about. We can talk about the cuts and the amounts and all of that kind of thing, but that is just spinning the wheels. What we really want to be doing is thinking, what is the future that we want to see happen? And then how can we collectively work towards getting there? And by collectively, it can mean working within your country, then your region. But what I've seen in some of the work we've done at Shabaka with the Diaspora Humanitarian Exchange Group, which is a group of diaspora representatives of different organisations from Syria, from Turkey, from Sudan, from Congo, from Nigeria, and they're sharing their experiences, they're supporting each other, they're helping each other learn how do you respond in this situation, how can you build partnerships that will help you do X, Y, and Z. These are the templates that we should be identifying and building upon. I don't know how many here are students, I don't know what you're studying, but as you're studying it, don't just take in the words verbatim, don't just take in the information and be like, oh, this is how you're supposed to work, this is supposed to be the path. Play with it, understand it, learn how the game is played, and then look at how to disrupt it, and how to make it work for the vision that you want to see happen as opposed to how it's been laid out to us to see happen. I'll stop there.
No, thank you, Albina. You really provided a foundation for then kind of start this conversation and what that means for different stakeholders. And I particularly like the emphasis on the importance of collective actions and what that looks like on the ground, but also regionally, and then how does that affect the continent, which is kind of our focus. Before I move I want to ask a question on remittances, but before I move to that, you mentioned localization. For those who don't know what that means, can you just give us a quick description?
God, definitions. Okay, so my interpretation of localization is working with those who are not connected to an institution or to the government, because it's a very wide group. It can go from anywhere from religious networks and organisations to home associations to we've been doing a lot of work in Sudan. So looking at Sudan, you've got the emergency response rooms, you've got community responders, you've got the diaspora, you've got students, all of these actors. And they are actors, they're not just volunteers, they're not just people doing good, they are responders. Having them recognised within the varying systems, mine predominantly is humanitarian, but also within the development sector. And so it's the idea of taking all of this big ideas and big working and bringing it, I don't want to say down because it has connotations that I'm not trying to suggest, but bringing it to the people who are doing a great deal and have a lot to contribute, and are often, as usual, not at the table, not in the cluster rooms, not in the discussions, not at the policy tables, and sort of helping to bring it closer together so they're not so far apart when decisions are being made. But also Google will help you.
Thank you. And so one of the things that you mentioned, and also it's kind of some of the responses that I saw online, there's a big emphasis on the role of remittances as a way to counteract, I guess, those aids. And I bring this question to you, Kirsty, because I know this is the work that you've done in your PhD. So the question for you is, so historically, what's the role the remittances have played in development, and what's the actually reality of it, as opposed to misconception that people have around, how, for example, migrants are able to send those remittances to their families and communities back home?
Yeah, so remittances historically have been used as a lifeline for a lot of people. They fund school fees for people. They fund medicine. People who need healthcare. Just they're mainly used for consumption. Going to the market, people doing their shopping, getting clothes. That's what remittances are normally or are typically used for. And so when the news of the cuts came and everyone was like, oh, there's so much money going to Africa. Actually, in 2023, Africans sent 90 billion US dollars back to the continent. And then that's just people outside of Africa. And there's also money being sent within the continent. And I believe in 2021, it was about $20 billion that's being sent intra-Africa. So, because again, the diaspora, in my opinion, is not just people who are outside of the continent. There are also very large diaspora communities within the continent. So, for example, my country of origin is Ghana, and the largest Ghanaian diaspora population is actually not in the US or the UK, it's in Nigeria. Right? And so these people are also sending money to their family members and to their communities, to their alumni associations from their universities and secondary schools. And so yes, when the news of the cuts came, everyone's like, oh, there's so much money going in remittances that extends far beyond what aid is. Because aid, again, I think in 2023, about close to $60 billion was sent in foreign aid, like totally to Africa, right? So 60 billion versus 90 billion, you can even say about 110 billion if you're including the intra-African remittances. Now, I personally am not of the opinion that remittances can be used to fund or can be used as a placeholder for aid, or that if we can just channel something for our governments and give them the money instead. People have been talking about, in the development space, there's been conversations going on since the 1990s about harnessing remittances for development. It's been happening for a very long time, and we're still having this conversation because, in my opinion, I don't think it's actually possible to do, because remittances are not sent for and they're not necessarily sent for investment purposes. They're sent to support, support people, support the communities back home that need the money. Now, that's not to say that people in diaspora communities aren't already investing. There's, people, you probably know someone, again, like Ghana is my frame of reference. So I know people who are starting all types of businesses from, cocoa farming to lash and nail bars, like anything you can think of, people are investing their money in. But the issue is that there isn't any kind of global framework or structure to really measure remittances, diaspora investments rather, in the same way that remittances are tracked. And so when we think about what we can do or how remittances can really be used in lieu of aid, I really don't think, and it feels controversial to say because that's what everyone is saying. Oh, yes, let's give the money to whoever, to the IOM, to the government. And people also forget that people send remittances because they trust the people that it is going to be sent to. People don't trust the government like that, right? People, they might not trust, the multilateral institutions like that in the same way they trust their auntie or they trust, the head of their old girl association or old boy association, right? So I think, I think what to Albina said though, the one caveat I would say is around collective action. There are organizations like Kwanzaa, I don't know if anyone is familiar with that. Okay, cool. Yeah. That are, they pool remittances essentially, and they're like, okay, this is a project that we're thinking about funding. I think there's like a voting structure. There's transparency and frameworks involved in how the money will be used and how they decide which project will get funded. So I think if we have something like that, but again, people trust Kwanda. Like there's trust there. People know that when they send the money, it's going to be used for this specific purpose. So until we can really increase trust in our governments, I think the best way for us to use remittances for development in lieu of aid is through collective action.
Thank you for that, Kirsty. And I think, there are two, and there are a number of points that the kind of you make, right? So first, the importance of a trusting relationship, knowing where the money goes.
Right.
But then also how the money is spent, in the sense that usually the remittances are sent to the community of family members who actually need it.
Right.
Right. So it is like direct point of contact between the person here and the person back home, wherever that might be, and how and why that money is sent and so on. That doesn't mean that the money is sent with ease.
Right.
That doesn't mean that the money is sent without, sacrifices. When people even talk about the black tax, often this is what they mean informally, right? So we all have family members or connections that need our support, and therefore this is where the money is going, which is different to kind of sending money in a way that it invests in infrastructure or supporting, in humanitarian crisis and so on.
Right. So I also want to add to your point about the black. There's the black tax, and then there's also the tax that is sent when sending money to Africa specifically, because it costs the most to send money to Africa versus anywhere else in the world as well. So in addition to all the sacrifices that people have to make to be able to just get the money to where it needs to go, there's additional, like, literal tax, right, on the money that is, or what is it, the transfer fees rather. That's an additional burden that people have to overcome when they're sending remittances.
Yeah, thank you. Which takes me to Buzayo. So a lot of the kind of conversation that I saw from you online kind of really reflected about the positionality of the diaspora, right? It's that also to be able to mobilize and be active in this way, it's a choice. That is not just something that you inherit and therefore you're entitled to do whatever you want. So maybe if you can tell us a little bit more of what you think the challenges are here within the diaspora, whether it's first generation, second generation, in terms of being mindful of our role and how we may impact the continent directly or even indirectly, but just looking, asylum seekers and refugees here, for example.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, first of all, of course, we use the word diaspora, but within that, there's so many different categories of diaspora, as you said, first generation, second generation. Different people from different regions also have different historical traumas as well. What's happened in Nigeria is not the same as what's happening in Sudan, right? And what's happening in Congo is not the same as happening in Eritrea, and so forth and so on. So it's not necessarily easily transferable what people are going through, and therefore, quote unquote, the reasons why they're here, right? So being a refugee and asylum seeker is different from being like an economic migrant and all that kind of stuff. But I'll say the main challenges are probably kind of like the old school one is identity. If the diaspora does not identify with Africa, the African continent, then it's very difficult to mobilize them around something. I think in the UK particularly, or in America, whatever, the concept of being black has kind of taken precedent. Because especially if you're second generation here, there are a lot of local issues that you deal with as well that kind of separate you from Africa at first glance, right? We all know it's a global system of racism and capitalism and all these things. But at the same time, when you come here, you can kind of feel like maybe like police brutality in the way it's done here is particularly egregious. Or I know we're sending remittances, but also we are, economically disenfranchised here as well. There's so many different things, institutional racism, how it manifests, all these kind of things that make you that separates you from potentially African struggles as you kind of like see it on paper. I would also say intergenerational conversations as well. What we're passing down, a lot of these movements are done in silos. So you don't really know about what's going on. Like when you talk about Kwanda, I know that's like actually historically we used to do that when we were here, particularly Caribbean communities, putting money in a pot and where the banks didn't give them any money or trust, you will kind of fill in that gap for yourself. A lot of our generation didn't grow up with that. So it's like actually relearning something that actually we should have already known. It kind of, it creates a barrier to build a momentum, right? I also think it's internalized, I don't know what the word is, but we've become that generation that have like identified with the imperialist as well. A lot of our ambitions for self, we don't recognize that it requires the subordination of the global south. So, for example, when you look at the influencer culture or fast fashion, many people want to aspire to be the salesperson for Zara or H&M, all that kind of stuff. Where those clothes go in? To the shores of Ghana. But obviously, strategically, these big brands want black people to buy it because we have so much cultural capital. But you'll see all the time when people try and make us feel good about ourselves and going, you know, the black community, the black pound is so great. We spend so much billions on all this stuff. But we are also one of the demographics that shouldn't spend money on that stuff, right? But when you're outside of traditional channels, they try and glorify channels for you to make yourself feel great, which we should. I think it's good to collect that information to show if you wanted to put it somewhere else, you could. However, we are not recognizing that we are being targeted for particular reasons because we like what we like. So if we see another one of us doing it, we're probably more likely to do that. So I'll say those are kind of like just a broad range of things. And outside of that as well, we haven't got that Pan-African kind of solidarity. I was just telling you as well, and I say this online a lot as well, like I've been helping like London for Sudan as well, organised protest. And I'm doing events with Congo as well. I've done stuff for the Africa Centre as well. But you don't see black people show up to these things in numbers. I always joke that if it's a day party, if Davido Wizkid was coming, people will sign up, right? It's natural. You want to celebrate African culture because you glorify that kind of version of it when it's shiny, right? When you get awards, when you feel like you're going to be in a day party and listen to Amapiano. That's the type of Africa that the diaspora likes to project, which it is an aspect of it. But at the same time, we also don't want to accompany that cultural capital with a political consciousness. For every time, people should know so much about what is going on in Africa because how big it is on social media, how big it is in our media, but we are misrepresenting what's happening. Obviously, disclaimer, we know how the media is. They will try and then pretend like nothing's going on. You know what I mean? They will try and only show us to be poor and all these kind of things. But I think we take the bait too much and we need to recognise that what is more important for us, do we need them to know that Africa is rich? No, because then they come there and they buy up everything and we can't access it. So why do we care if they think it's poor? Let them think it's poor. But again, when you care so much about what they think, all these systems stuff are tailored to like the imperialist eye. So I think we've kind of identified with that. We don't show up for ourselves. You know, and places like, as I mentioned before, Congo and Sudan need all of us, but a lot of us don't show up in the important ways. And if we don't show up for ourselves, we can't rely on the benevolence of demographics that they're not immediately attached to it. And I think if you keep going with that entitlement, you'll lose out because other movements, their demographics will be there, at least at the centre, then ask for help. You can't be absent from your own movement and ask for help and thinking someone else is going to be the core of your movement and you join in when the movement already has momentum. That's not how it works. So we need to stop acting like the works of our ancestors are the works that we've done. We build upon them, but you can't say that we went through what they went through. You can't say that our people have been so tired for years, but we haven't been tired for years. Right? As a people, yes, we are tired, but I can't personally say that I'm too tired not to fight for racial justice or African empowerment because I haven't. But we rely on what our aunties did, our mums did, our dads did, our grandpas did, and kind of trying to disguise it as our own activism. So, yeah, that's a long-winded way to say that.
I mean, I think this is a very important conversation to have. I mean, that in itself can be a whole panel, a whole lecture. There's literally so much to unpack. But one of the things that really comes up for me is also this, I guess, navigating our positionality and what it means to be marginalized here, but also what it means to be marginalized in the continent as well. And so how do we see each other's humanity, right? How do we see, yes, I need to save myself first before I save others, but actually not understanding how our experiences are very much intertwined. Like you can't do one without the other. Like the example of the clothes going to Ghana Shore is a very linear example of that, right? Which brings me to Myron and the work that you do with your team at the Pan-African Society. I came across, you were building boxes to collect funds for Sudan. I was like, oh, what is this? So I basically, I was just passing by and saw you doing this. So I was like, oh, what are you doing? I said, oh, I'm part of the, Pan-African Society. I was like, oh, tell me more. So why do you think it's important for students, for young people to be involved in this work as well? And kind of in relation to what Buzayo just said, I think a lot of the time there is a gap across generation, and we are not talking to each other, and we're not learning and kind of following from the legacy that we have. So it's not something that we need to reinvent necessarily, but it's just something that we need to carry on. So what kind of propelled you as a group of students to create that space within SOAS?
Okay, thank you very much. Backstory, we're actually planning 2 alternative conferences on the exact same day and the exact same time to discuss issues in Africa. So this was like divine providence. But then, my name is Myron. I'm a current student here at SOAS, pursuing my master's degree. And for me, I would say it's interest, intentionality, and for the most part for my team, it's sacrifice. Because like you mentioned earlier, there's a gap which is very clear and prevalent between this generation and the past generation. Like Busayo mentioned, we haven't suffered the things that they have been through. But then when connecting to things like aid, the first thing when you hear on people's mouth, when you hear the US has cut aid to Africa is we're helpless, what do we do? And most of the narratives we have in classes, the courses are being taught is, oh, they need the West, Africans need these people to help them, they can't do something for themselves. And it makes me question the narrative, like, why are we so helpless? Why is it that we are constantly reinforced with this ideology that we can't do something for ourselves? Because obviously they've taught us some things, but before they came, we existed as a people. So why is there this prevailing narrative? And in our Pan-African meetings, we always discuss this concept that begs people to question themselves with the psychology of things. Because aid, for instance, when you look at it, is the provision to Africa, but with conditions that makes Africa become what it is not. So you have to lose yourself, you have to lose your identity because you want to receive help. When you think about remittances, remember, remittances is going from one person to the other. So right now, there's a crisis in Sudan, there's a crisis in Congo. Millions of people are dying. Not many of them even have mobile phones to get a remittance. So who is this remittance going to? It's going to people who have this technology, this privileged access. Then again, like Busayo said, people who haven't struggled or who aren't tired. So what about the people, the mass body of people that can't get access to these things? What happens to them and who's thinking about them? And not to talk about the fact that remittances has a percentage on it that's like 7 or 9% that they're claiming is going to be reduced. But at the end of the day, the West always comes with sustainability, goals and developments. Today in class, we had this lecture that said African Union has a goal for 2063 on redefining Africa. And I and my colleague Sophie were discussing about how this is just an elaboration of the previous, I don't want to say lies, but the previous promises that has not been fulfilled, being pushed forward to the future again. And the entire reinforcement to me just looks like a crippled mentality for the African population, especially my generation. It weakens you. It takes the power from your hand to think for yourself, to plan for yourself, to have ideologies and actions, activities you could take. So if they can provide aid from a small level, from a small instance that can become something so great that is considered USAID, what's stopping us as Africans to begin to provide these things for ourselves? And so in the Pan-African Society, we decided to take on a project where we collected donations from students. So that's clothing and things. I'm partnered with someone on the panel, Mubarak, these refugee organizations, and also to donate these clothing to Sudanese personnel that have fled the Sudan from the Sudan conflict that are here currently in London. But then the major idea behind that was just so that other students around campus can see these things, just like she saw me, and we're able to partner and think, oh, okay, I don't have to actually go above and beyond, write a 500 million worded paper to ask for the most money to be able to do something actionable to reach out to people. It stems from intentional action. So for the youth of this generation, it's really to just have, like was mentioned earlier by everyone on this platform, collective action, but action from lack of self-interest. So remove yourself from it and actually be informed. And many people don't know what's going on right now. Many people are not aware of the problems of this world. And I always say this thing, coincidentally, I think we're from the same country, Nigeria. I always say this thing. Why do people complain when you're trying to gather donations, but then you're going for concerts happily? Because there's this thing in my country called Dirty December. You don't see people show up to Nigeria any time of the year as much as it comes to Dirty December, when it's time to party. And Nigeria is an amazing place to be, don't get me wrong, when it comes to having the best nightlife out, having an engage, go out, have fun, live your best life, forget like you have worries. It's amazing. But at the end of the day, another thing that I've questioned is these people, like, coming to celebrate the culture is great, but then the standard of living within that community is being raised. So the local people can no longer afford to have a Dirty December because more people are coming to claim interest in celebrating culture, raising the standard of that living. But then where is now the long-term investments that keeps that culture sustained? Over time, it will be eroded and lost because the inflation, the cost will not allow people to continue in that direction. Or aid will come and it will belong to some foreign country. So it's up to us youth to actually wake up, go against the psychology of the imperialists rather than thinking into their books, as has been discussed in many Pan-African meetings. Go against that narrative, and rather than having the mindset of, oh, this Pan-African leader did it, but it failed, it can't. And I'll wrap up really quickly, but that's another narrative that's been going around in the meetings when we've been asking students questions like, oh, what do you think about this leader? Not mentioning names, just to be safe, but what do you think about this leader and their ideology, their mindset? And people go like, oh, it failed, it can't work, they were too idealistic. And I gave the examples like when an imperialist came to a land and said, I'm going to take this land, no one said they're too idealistic. They wanted to do it and they did it. So what's stopping you from doing the exact same in the land? And then people are like, oh, well, but then you need to begin to challenge this narrative, because if they keep telling you you can't do something, but they wake up one day and choose to do something, then what stops you? So for this youth, people need to actually, this is our generation, our youth, we need to actually wake up and have the mindset, have the intentionality to take up something sacrificially and run with it, because nothing good is done with by cheap labor or easy labor. So, but that's it. Thank you.
Again, you're making a lot of important points that kind of relates to what you were saying earlier, Busayo, around to be a diaspora that is conscious and is mobilizing. You need to be mindful of your own positionality and how your presence, how your efforts also impact local communities, for example, in those times like the December, but also beyond that, how it affects the livelihoods. Even if the intention may be positive, even if the intention is to celebrate your culture, and there's nothing wrong with that, let's also be mindful of how else is our presence is affecting them. I'm going to Mubarak, last but not least. We already talked a little bit about the crisis in Sudan. We talked about the role of the diaspora, aid institutions, but also how our positions change, right? And so for you, who's somebody who is from Sudan, has lived in Sudan and is now in the UK, and you funded these two organizations, one that supports asylum seekers in Sheffield, where you're based, SOAS Sudan, and the other one that supports Sudanese in West Sudan, Kilma, right? So why did you think it was important? Why was it important for you to set up an organization that supported Sudanese in the diaspora and in the continent?
That's great. That's a good question. Actually, this is so important for students, especially because I'm a practical person. I came from a TV background as a filmmaker or director, so I'm more practical. It's better for me to tell you, grab your camera, capture it, let's do it and broadcast it, which is easier than planning it and do the event. So the idea here is, for the last 2 years, Sudanese, they are facing real crisis in Sudan. And what makes me feel bad that the absence of media from Sudan crisis, nobody knows. So in last August, while I was doing my MA filming, so I started to do just an event to let people donate for Sudan. And I thought most of them, they will know about the crisis in Sudan and the war. I was shocked. More than 300 or 350, they were inside that room and they said, we don't know that even there is a war in Sudan. So I was shocked, and I said, one of them was a doctor. He's 85 years old, and he was living in the same area that I used to live while I was a child. So he said, I don't know that there is a war in Sudan. There is a war in Sudan for the last year. So people, they don't know about the war in Sudan. Actually, the Sudanese, they're dying hunger. Now I'm talking to you, and they're dying hunger. Because of their dignity, they're not asking other countries or other people and begging them to have food or to help them or donate for them. If you have a look at any Sudani outside of Sudan, they are helping each other. They're keeping silent and trying to work harder and harder and harder. If they used to work for 5 hours, now they're working for 12 hours, 16 hours to help their families, their neighbors, their friends, and other as well. So the problem came from this side, and I started to do, and I decided in that time, because plenty of Sudanese, they came and arrived to where I live, which is Sheffield. All of them, they came through a very, very hard and complicated journey. Before I started the charity, I was thinking to do 2 or 3 films. 2 of them are documentaries, and one of them is a drama based on a true story. So I took away my dream, which is, I don't think that a filmmaker will take away his film or his life film away and then look after something different unless it's really necessary. If you have a look at the people in Sudan, they're really struggling, even if they are fleeing outside or displaced outside of Sudan. If they're going to Egypt, they don't have camps, so you don't know the numbers. The country there is trying to gain benefits of the refugees and asylums, especially the Sudanese, because they're not in camps, so we don't know the numbers, we don't know the services. So the government is taking the money and saying, okay, I'm giving it to the Sudanese, but no. Plenty of them return back to Sudan, more than 100,000 refugees. Chad, African country as well, they're suffering as well, they don't have that much to spend. Ethiopia, Libya, let's name the countries. So the Sudanese become outside everywhere. So they took the journey from Sudan to UK, let's say, some of them. So they have to go through Libya, Morocco, let's say Tunisia, and then Spain or Italy, until that they reach France, Calais, then UK. One of the films that while I was doing the MA, a guy, his name is Hafiz. So Hafiz came to the summer school and we started to do for him a film about his journey. But suddenly I found out that while he was in one of the North African countries, the police was trying to stop them to go through to Spain. So they are not allowed them to do that. More than 100 young Sudanese were being killed with a bloody hand. Nobody cared. Nobody cared. Yes, we have a book now. We wrote a book about this, but the book will do nothing. So if you're asking me, media is really important. I used to work also while there was a war conflict between Gaddafi and his own people. They never won. They won because of the media. So simple. People were calling us on TV and say, hey, Gaddafi in that room. In that room, not in that house, in that room, in that house. So media is the power. But in Sudan, in Africa, we have absence of media. We don't know what to do. So a new generation like you will help us a lot. We need to think in a different way. And practical, It's better for me if you ask me just right now, what are you going to do? I will tell you that, okay, this is the technology. I have, let's say, a sky view from any of the satellite. I know that people here, they need food. These people, they need food here. So let's use a technology to help them. So I will come back again to the question, the main question, which is why I started to help the people here. I started to help more than 150 asylum seekers in Sheffield. 60% of them now, they received the status, and they start to work, start to study, and they started to help their families. So if I help their families, who is going to help them here? I don't want to see them on the streets. I don't want to see them to become drug dealers or to be somewhere, hard to get them out, or to have. Most of them they have a trauma. They're traumatized. Nobody cares. Nobody helped them. So one of them, he lost his two brothers and his father as well in the same month. His two brothers are with the Rapid Support Force, and his father is with the Sudanese army. So it's not about two parties who they are fighting in Sudan. It's not about just the countries around. It's about the global. It's about our minds. What are we going to do as African? If you ask me what I love to do, the first thing is a train line between the countries. There is no. If I have aid and I want to send it from Port Sudan, Red Sea, to the west or in the middle of Africa, what do we have? We have nothing. Airplanes cost a lot of money. So if you're talking about the money that you're sending, and then if you're sending the money from here and it costs you a lot of money, because of the intermediate banking and exchange, and so if we have a train line, it will be easier for us to do anything, to have trading between the countries. So that's why I decided now to help those people, so they will help their families back in Sudan. So 60 people is more than enough for me, and now they become, let's say, seniors, so they can help also more than 120 new arrivals. 3 days ago, we received 35 new Sudanese. They were just passing by us on the street. They found us that we are doing the iftar breakfast in our area. So we're doing that now for the 17 days, and we're going to do it for the next 13 days from our own pockets. Nobody's helping. But we do that. £5, £10, we do that, and we're feeding people. So I'm just getting back again to the same point of the question. So I'm a filmmaker, so sorry about that. But more practical as well. So if you ask me, I see things in a different way, from a different point of view. I don't see things that I have to plan for it. So I decided straight away to start help the asylum seekers. I started to do conversation clubs. I registered them to study, help them with to find solicitors, so they know what to do, they know their rights. Then they get a status, and now they are starting to study and work and help their families. And they are kind of away from the trauma that they were passing through their journey. So if more questions are ready, I just want to stop here.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your story, and there are a number of points that you raised. First of all, the importance of media in terms of shifting the narratives. And as you were speaking, even when you mentioned, who has the technology, the only reason why we know what's happening in Palestine is because people have their phones and they're speaking in English. Even the language. People are going through very traumatic stuff, experiences, and having to speak in a language that's not even their own mother tongue in the most traumatic kind of times of their lives. So even that conscious effort tells you is kind of to cater to the empathy of the West, of us in the diaspora, because they know that if something is not in English and if it's not accessible, nobody will talk about it, which is what we're not seeing a lot in Sudan, a lot in Congo, and so on, right? But then also the importance of collective action, which has been the common theme here, whether it's, how our communities work already is already kind of cultural within many African countries without romanticizing it. I think in moments of struggle there is a sense of community organizing, and so how does that transfer when there is a crisis, like the one that we have now? And so we see it on the ground and we see it in the diaspora. Perhaps I wanted to bring to the panel, maybe start with you, Kirsty, because one of the issues that kind of relates to what you were talking about is also the rise of anti-immigration policies, the rise of far rights movement, not only in the UK but in Europe, in everywhere really. Yes, in the US, and so. Again, when we talk about diaspora, we are also essentially talking about migrant communities. Yes. Many of them have come as refugees, although not all. And so how does that affect us? How does that affect our day-to-day, our ability not only to sustain ourselves and to organize, but also our ability to support those in the continent? I know you were kind of looking at the US and the UK. So what are you seeing in terms of migrant communities and how they've been impacted by it?
Yeah, so in the U.S. at the moment, there's a lot of fear. Some people did see what is transpiring coming, but others did not. And so we're now seeing people trying to figure out how to best protect themselves, protect their families. And I know there's also, like as you said, there's been a shift globally regarding anti-immigration laws and policies. So it's not just the US, it's the UK, Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, Canada even.
Italy.
Yeah, Italy, yes, it's all over. So that fear is also exists in migrant communities outside the US as well. So what we're seeing, people trying to figure out how to protect themselves, I would say legally, is the first place, because with all the changes that are happening, people are, especially in the U.S., finding themselves in ICE detention. Thinking about the young man, I can't remember his name, it was a student at Columbia, Mohammed Khalid, yes, was a green card holder. Green card holders in the U.S. have a lot of the same rights and privileges as U.S. citizens. It's essentially like the last step someone can take before they become a citizen. And to be put in ICE detention and deported as a green card holder it can happen, but only for very serious offenses. And so the fact that this young man has not committed any serious crime or offense, but has been put in ICE detention is telling. And there's been other instances of that as well. So people are trying to figure out how can they protect themselves regardless of their status. They're thinking, how am I going to be able to send money to people back home, right? Because if they have a change in their legal status, they might not be able to work. And in this country, in the UK, as Mubarak said, if you are in this country as an asylum seeker, if you haven't been granted that status yet, you can't work, right? And so that's something that people who work in that space are really, really advocating for, because I know people need, more than just, yes, the livelihood, but I think, I don't know, it's the right to say, I don't know if it's the right word to say, but people want to live dignified lives, right? Yes, okay. Yeah. People want to live dignified lives, and one of the ways in this capitalist world that we live in is to do that through work. There's quite a bit that's going on, but we're also seeing a lot of collective action, and I know that's something that we keep coming back to, and I think it's really important because we're seeing in the U.S. People who are immigration attorneys, right? They're now doing a lot of work online, sharing as much information as they can. They are in the churches, they're in the mosques, they're in other community spaces, trying to share as much information as they can so people can have the knowledge that they need to protect themselves. And I know similar work is also going on here, and there should be I think it's important for everyone to know what's going on, right? And so there should be, I think, hopefully in the next maybe few weeks or so, an immigration white paper that's coming out from the UK government that's going to talk about how the changes that are going to take place in regards to the immigration system here. And there's already been changes from how they do the skilled worker visa, the salary thresholds, not allowing dependents to come. So that's also then impacting how people, like who can even migrate, right? Like if you can't bring your family with you, you're not going to want to migrate. So there's a lot. There's so much going on, and it is. If I'm honest, sometimes it does feel overwhelming to try to, keep up to date with everything that's going on. But people really are trying to do the best they can to protect themselves. Like I said, legally protect themselves, protect their communities, get the information get the information that they need to still to thrive still in spite of everything.
To keep hopeful.
Yes.
The hope, right?
Yes.
Because also this is not the first time that we're going through this. There's a history. I mean, my own work, looking at immigration policies in the UK and Italy, like we've been here before. Like there was a time where there was funding for refugee community organization and they were thriving because they were basically doing the work that the government wasn't doing. But in the same way, that meant that you had support that was culturally sensitive, that was actually looking after you and helping you integrate in this society, right? So by cutting all the fundings, what they're doing is basically leaving people destitute with not taking off the agency, right? So if you come back to the conversation today, what does agency looks like on a micro level here and individual level, but then at the macro when we think about development and the continent. I guess that takes me to a question for Elvina. So we spoke a bit about the mobilization that already exists within the diaspora, which is underfunded, clearly, but is actually doing some of the most impactful work. So given the kind of political context that we're in now, what does that mean for even diaspora civil society who are supporting whether asylum seekers here or supporting civil society back home?
And this is the question. I mean, so much as what's been said is going to be having an increasing impact on that support that the varying communities have been able to have, and hats off to you because it is literally the work like what you're doing that has helped and supported so many different communities. So one of the things we're going to see as we're seeing tighter and tighter immigration policy, and also seeing what used to be seen as safe spaces also becoming immigration offices, schools, hospitals, your usual places of where you should be able to interact, landlords.
Yeah.
This is all having an impact on how the diaspora are able to go out and live their lives. Some, not all. And so we'll see as the policies get tighter, you'll see less and less people being able to come and work and remit and support families and so on, as we've been talking about. And this is on purpose. All the things we've said, it's about creating a hostile or inhospitable environment, because after all those lovely things that the UK were doing, people wanted to come to the UK. And so now they don't want them to come, so you have to make the space inhospitable. And it was local communities who helped to try and plug that gap still, and this is what we're going to see challenges around. So right now I think it will start to retreat back to maybe smaller, collective ways of working, community-centred ways of working. People are looking at other avenues. Shabaka has been supported quite a bit by philanthropic organisations and foundations. So it's looking at the sort of charitable arm of private sector. And while this is a good space to look at, you've got your corporate social responsibility, you've got your foundations, you've got your philanthropic families. They also, though, have their own focus and interest. So it's a different kind of support, but it will also still come with whatever structures, boundaries, restrictions that they want to see when they're providing funds to do varying kinds of work. So as there will still be money there, but it's just about how you're able to access it and tap into it. Can I jump and respond to some of the comments that have come around? It's very interesting listening to you, and some of the things that you were saying, but I'm interested to know generally How many people in here have read Africa 2063, the AU's vision for the future? And what did you think of it? How did you find it?
Vague.
Vague. Okay.
Well, it is the same document that has been produced by the EU, by the UN, so we cannot say it vague, but it has been a template that has been used to produce a document. So,
Okay.
trying to address the global issues.
Well, when I read it, I saw it as what I was calling a love letter to Africa, because it was this vision of what it was wanting to achieve across the whole spectrum of all the areas, be it housing, security, da 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 da. And okay, it has its faults, it's vague, it has to be, it's covering a whole continent, so it's never going to be a complete step-by-step guide. But in some of the discussions we have and in the work that we do, I feel, and just hearing, and I sounded exactly the same when I was going through my early days of learning about all of this space, that we disconnect from these institutions because we don't like everything that they're doing, but they're still there. We don't like everything our governments are doing, but they're still there. So if we keep disengaging and not raising our voice and not advocating and not pushing for what we want to see, then we're not going to see the changes. And this is really the time where you have to do it. We have to do it. Because if we don't, then yes, the EU, the UN, the varying nations who have that influence will be taking those spaces. And then in regards to the tech and remittances not reaching all the spaces, I mean, Sudan has been a fantastic example of how the innovation between the diaspora and local responders are using tech to get the money to point A and then using inner networks to get the money to point C, D, E, F and everywhere else. And so again, it's about how we're working and learning from each other that really taps into it. Dr. Sarah, if you don't know about her work, please do speak to her, because the things that these diaspora Sudanese medics are doing with tech, with WhatsApp and telemedicine and simulation-based education is phenomenal. And we can learn from this and use it in other spaces and so on. So, yeah.
Thank you. And I want to bring it, I guess, back to our kind of local struggles within the diaspora and bring it to you, Busayo, because you spoke about, all the different factors that play a role on how we engage, not only with each other here in the diaspora, but also with the continent and with the issues that affect different communities. And there's just a disparity, between, for example, engaging culturally as opposed to politically. And as you said, it's not that it's an issue to engage culturally, because also we need to have a space for joy, right? Something like spaces where we can nurture each other so that it can help us through the struggle unfortunately, for a longer period of time. It's not like a sprint, right? So how would you... noticing all these challenges that we experience both locally and transnationally, how would you go about, I guess, thinking a way to dismantle those hierarchies that exist within different segments of the diaspora? So we know, for example, the organizations like the one from Mubarak who are supporting asylum seekers, led by asylum seekers. We may have, there may be other issues that as a diaspora we are facing, for example, here in the UK. And yet we sometimes struggle to see your struggle as my struggle, So what do you think is some of the ways that we can engage it? It's a big question.
It's such a big question. What are the ways? I think, first of all, you kind of have to take it back and not assume that because you're an ethnic minority here, that you are automatically empathetic. I think there's some things in us that we feel like, because of our histories, we have already reached the peak empathy and there's nothing for us to learn before we engage. But there's humility in knowing that we live in a particular context and even our concept of liberation is skewed by the structures that we're in. So if you are able to at least challenge that and critique that, you're more open to different ways of doing things, for example. So I think that's one thing, is also have a humility towards activism. I think if you're not humble, you don't, number one, respect the people that came before you, and you just feel like because you're angry now, it's your time, that you can just run riot when before you were awake, this was happening. I know you said that Sudan's in war. Sudan has had a series of tragic conflicts, right? And this might be the one we're most conscious of. So there's a humility when you step into the conversation that you just don't assume or you demand everyone to be angry just like you. Because when you weren't awake, people were demanding you to be angry. So you have to kind of make this productive, but you can only do that if you're humble about when you enter that conversation. I think if people don't really dissect capitalism enough. I know people say, when people say capitalism, people check out, it's like this big structure, but it's like, it's the only thing we don't really interrogate. We try and talk about race and representation and equality, but we don't interrogate capitalism, which has been the common denominator of this for time memorial. Because we believe that we don't hate the structures that exist, right? We just hate our position in it. Okay? A lot of the American dream, the British dream, isn't about us going, I hate wealth. It's bring me in, right? You know what I mean? It's not, you don't really hate people that have bread. You're just upset that they didn't bring you. So that's another thing. Do you hate capitalism? Do you have selective justice? Do you hate what's going on in Nigeria only? But when it comes to Sudan, you're like, why do we need to even educate you about what's going on in Sudan? Because you're not from there, somebody who don't know what's going on in Sudan? What kind of a life do you live? Because I guarantee you know certain people's business that you shouldn't know. So when you look at that, interrogate that. So I'm trying to answer the question, but I think basically it's an interrogation of self first, it's a humility. It's also extending your identity beyond the, let's say, false state structures that you've been given, right? The fact that your love can only come from a parameter that was created during colonialism is beyond me. It's not even real barriers, right? Borders, but yet you only identify within those borders when your demographics flow between these borders all the time. So you have to really understand and contend with your own misinformation about Africa and try and build that up. That's the only way you're going to have empathy that extends beyond self, okay? And I would also say that one of the biggest things that we can do is recognize the privilege that we have in being resident citizens of a place like the UK or America or Europe. We're the only diaspora that have the ear of the G7. A lot of us come from or live in countries that have a UN veto vote. Right? No one's telling you have to be the activist on the ground all the time and doing different things. Obviously, we're built to do different things and your heart moves a different way. But one thing you can collectively do is that when you go and vote and you say you're not voting for yourself, that's cool.
Yeah.
But we have the only PM, right, that if he really doesn't believe in anything, he can veto something in the UN. Other people from other diasporas can't go to the UN and get a conversation. They're just observers at best if they're chosen. Right? So when you think about your position in the global system, it's not just some minor thing. You can talk about this. Why are people protesting for Palestine outside? Because we belong in a system where the UK sends arms there. They train people, right? They are in cahoots with, I don't want to, disrupt your thingy, but with certain states, right, that are creating genocides. You're asking people who are perpetrating. That's why when it comes to Sudan and Congo, it's important for us to speak up because this is the global microphone that we have. So I think it's important for us to recognize our unique privilege of having the veto vote, of having governments that not everyone goes to meet Donald Trump. I wouldn't go, obviously, there's no reason. But, not everyone does that. Do you see Tinubu be invited to meet Donald Trump? For what? He'll tweet you and tell you this is what he's going to do, Nigeria's next trade deal. He don't need to come and meet you. That's not a respect he has for Nigeria. But our presidents are out here trying to negotiate wars online. Yeah. So I think trying to go back and be brief is recognize that particular political power that you have is basically one of the first things that we can do, contend with it. Obviously there's a guilt that we have because we perpetuate this, and I did a recent video recently that I was basically saying we've now become the white men that we used to talk about, right? The imperialist machine is no longer just white men and the rest of us. By default of being here in our geopolitical proximity, our consumption patterns are now part of the Western consumption patterns. Right? We're no longer detached. It's not about an ethnic minority. When we buy stuff, when we do this, it's still the women in Bangladesh that's making our clothes. Yeah. We're not excused from that because we have a history of genocide. That doesn't work like that. But what we can do, right, is recognize that actually, okay, cool, I've got a position here. How am I best used? I'm not going to be a soldier on the front line, but what I can do is make sure if I don't care about Labour or Conservative or the Reform Party, cool. But who does? Who can benefit? Who will benefit from the foreign policy that they might implement? So I think it's just contending with our new imperialist status and being like, actually, what can I do here? If you just retreat back to the victimization and that, oh my gosh, we were part of the transatlantic stature, which is important, you will miss out on the opportunities to use your power.
There's so much that you covered, but I think at the foundation of it is we need to unlearn what we learned by virtue of being here in this space and recognize how our positionality here can also be used as a form of power, right? Let's empower ourselves. We all have some level of power and privileges, and this can be used. Yes, there is the guilt, but what's a more, impactful way to think about it so that we can support those who are within our local context, but also globally, right? Myron, I'll bring it to you because there's a lot of conversation around unlearning and learning, and you mentioned earlier, some of the things that we learn in class, in the classroom, which may not reflect the reality that we've been discussing today, right? The books will not necessarily reflect it in the same way. Now, as students historically have been the force of any revolutionary power everywhere. It's always been students, right? So I think it's really important that that you came together to create this society and to mobilize to even raise awareness, for Sudan. So, what do you envision for the future for this society, particularly with having in mind how even students are struggling, right? Like cost of living crisis, mental health concerns, like what you learn in the classroom and how that can be also re-traumatizing for those for students who came from a racialized background, migrant background, and so on. So where is the hope and the action for students?
Okay, thank you very much for that question. First, disclaimer, I didn't create the society. The president is over there. His name is Farmer. He created the society and recruited us. So I'm just outreach. But the overall goal, the vision that we discussed during the meetings coming together is this theme that you brought up, which is to unlearn what has been learned. Because then again, most of information works or how power and knowledge works is whoever is controlling it and whoever holds the money to fund it. And so, for instance, African Union, great organization, but then who's funding the African Union? It's not Africans, it's Europeans. Academic work, what are the, standard academic works that are being referenced? The history of Africa that's not written by Africans. And so sometimes when you're hearing narratives and discourses, you're like, I lived something that's not what you're saying. I'm originally from Nigeria, I'm a Nigerian citizen. So I'm part of the sad majority that can be an observer as best, but Tinubu will always be sleeping, so I guess not. I can't observe. But so it's like the narrative of, oh, this is what Africa has been like, and this is what Africa must do, or this is theoretical terms like, oh, you must take a analytical path to success, but that mindset needs to be removed. And so the goal of the society is to create the framework of saying, I'm just like you. I'm doing something, and not because I became a scholar by learning the analytical work. We're all students together, but then some of us are sacrificing our time, because my teammates, I tell you, they've gone over and beyond over the past couple of weeks. I don't think they're students anymore with the way they've been advertising and raising awareness for donating for Sudan and curating the meetings, reading more for Pan-African societies just so that they can educate other students on what is the reality of the issues going on in Africa, in Congo. And so the self-sacrifice aspect too, the humility, like you mentioned, is really key. We need people to begin to connect with this and not just wait for it to be some Pan-African great leader, I'm not going to mention any names, name so that's not used against me. But then, so not just some Pan-African great leader that we read in the history books and say, oh, this was someone that led the movement that was nearly successful until they got killed. And to also remove the mindset of fear that makes our youth feel like the moment you try to be great, they're going to hunt you down and kill you. I'm not saying it's not true, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that it won't bring about the change that we want, because nothing exactly is built without sacrifice. Like they say, legends are only legends after they're gone. Not saying that anyone should go sacrifice them. so anything. But then that's the major goal for the Pan-African Society, is for people to actually take interest. And the psychological twist, like, rather than read a book and say, because you read this scholarly article, this is what it is, look at reality. The scholarly article might be great, might be from, then again, Western accredited institutions that will always drive their own narrative. It's not wrong when people come out and say, how dare they do this? The thing is, there is no person, even family, within families now, there's no one who won't go out to pursue their own interests for their own society. Like, a family will want to protect their territory first. So when the West come and they do things that is to the disadvantage on Africa, the onus is on Africans to also do things that will be to the advantage of Africans. But then many people are wanting to preserve themselves first in Africa. So it's like, me first, and then everybody else can figure out their lives. The mentality in Nigeria now is, when I get to power, I want to have my share of the national cake. That's what they call the things, that the money that you get from being in government or something. But that's the thing, we will never get to that level of growth or freedom of change or whatever it is that we seek to achieve if we're remaining boxed in this mindset and narratives. And so if another country or another institution comes and they want to carry out their agendas, they are at liberty to do so. The question is, when are we going to wake up and carry out our agendas? When are we going to choose to contest and be against the system? Like she said, we don't hate the capitalist system. We just hate that we're not getting it. I don't like the capitalist system. We just hate that we're not getting it. And it's true. I hate when I'm moving around the UK and I'm seeing so many developed buildings and roads, and I think about my home country. I'm like, why can't I be happy to be in my home country like this? I want to go home. This place isn't. But so that's the goal for the African Society.
Thank you. I think it's important, in relation to what you said, given that we're having this conversation at a university, understanding also that knowledge production happens in many different spaces, right? And we just exist in a space where maybe degrees and so on have a higher value, but then we miss all the kind of more informal learning that exists already with our communities, like even going back to the Kwanda and how this is a practice that already exists in so many places before. It's not new, right? But unless you engage with people from different generations and different communities, you won't know that, and you kind of stick to just formal education. And formal education presents a very kind of distinct perspective. So it's also about being critical about what you learn. But perhaps one of the other things that you mentioned that was really important is to understand the value that behind all the kind of leaders, so the recognizable leaders, there's always a community work that is often invisible, right? This leader does not come out of nowhere. There is a whole momentum of generation of people who are doing the work, the invisible work, that then meets you at a certain historic point in history, which means that, these are the individuals who happen apparently to be all male, but we know, and this is another conversation, but it's important to mention, right? And I want to, close with you, Mubarak, because obviously you're doing this incredible work with the organization. You gave us some points on, action points that you can do, whether it's locally, whether it's through changing the narratives, raising awareness, but also supporting who you see around you. What's a kind of a call to action that you have, for those who are attending this event, particularly because when you were talking about the Sudanese diaspora and how they're working very closely, my whole social media was just Sudanese diaspora creating all the infrastructure, the innovation to support their home country. And it's great that we are able, I'm not Sudanese, I'm Eritrean, but that we support, our country when they're in moment of crisis, but that should not just rely on a Sudanese diaspora, right? And so for those of us who are part of this kind of more Pan-African community, what can we do to support Sudanese and other crises similarly?
That's a good question, actually. And I was working for the last couple of months to hear that question. What can we do for Sudan? Awareness, first of all. I don't want you to pay money to donate. I want you to let other know Sudan crisis, and people are dying hunger. We don't ask people food, but we're dying, and they're dying, and they're still dying. And while I'm talking to you, I'm sure more than 1,000 persons is dying. Hunger, away from traumatized, become crazy. Kids. One thing, I'll be back to your question. I like that question, but I have homework for all of you. We have a generation over 2 years of it's not a civil war, of a war or crisis in Sudan. What are you going to do for them in the future? Any solution? Nothing. I will see you maybe if I'm alive after 10 years, and let's see. What are we going to do for those two generations of a war? And we are in war since 56. So generation after generation, war after war. Why? Question. So what we need to, all of us, we start from our own self to help Sudan. Find out how that you can help Sudan, either by awareness, media, social media. Let's talk, speak loudly, and find out how that you can help any Sudanese around you, here, before you go back to Sudan. Look at them, working hard, killing themselves, away from you. They smile on your face, but they're crying behind the doors. Then let's see how that we can help the local organizations in Sudan from here. That's all what I can say.
Thank you. So I think we're coming to an end, I'm afraid. I know we can be here for the whole evening, but it's already 8 p.m. So if we can just thank our panelists for a really engaging conversation.